knock once for yes.
I am Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
Greetings, lovely listeners. We've had a super busy month rushing around, visiting lots of amazing new locations for upcoming episodes, and planning even more for future visits. It's been a fantastic whirlwind of road trips and exciting planning, but as lovely as it was, we must admit that we're quite glad to be back at KOFY HQ, behind the microphone again, talking to you all and sharing our adventures.
If you support us on Patreon, you'll have already had a sneak peek of which spooky location we're headed for this time, and we very much hope you enjoyed that vlog. Keep your eyes peeled for the next location coming to the Patreon feed very soon. And now, without further ado, I'll let Fitz fill you in on what spine-tingling goodies we've got coming up this episode.
Coming up, we have a haunted Scottish village for sale on the Paranormal radar, listener stories from Andy, Selena and Holly, and we head back to the coast to visit a haunted Roman fort.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a big, huge, massive and heartfelt thank you to our latest patrons.
Mark Leslie,
Kelly,
Jade,
Travis Varga,
and thank you to Ben Jackson-Ling, Debbie Snell, Marion Welsh and Kerry Goodall for upping their pledges.
And thank you also to Liz and Jacqueline for their donations via KOFY. Thank you so much to all of our patrons, old and new. It's only through your help that we're able to continue producing the show, and we're so grateful for your support and the opportunity to continue our spooky adventures. And we're excited to have you on board as we continue this weird and wonderful journey together, hopefully for many years to come. Well, now on to today's weird and wonderful journey into the paranormal. And Fitz, what's on today's paranormal radar?
Well, what has pinged the Paranormal radar this episode is a haunted village for sale up in Scotland. It is very reasonably priced, asking for offers over £125,000. The 3-acre site includes a private beach on the shore of Loch Tay, woodland and trout fishing rights, but the village itself is in less than perfect condition. Most interesting for us, though, is that the village is said to be haunted. The ghosts of villagers flitting between the crumbling ruins that once provided them warmth and shelter, but now slowly being reclaimed by nature. One ghost in particular, though, stands out more than the rest. The old village of Laws was supposedly inhabited by a woman named Mary Campbell, a 17th century Scottish seer who became known as the Lady of Laws. She made a number of prophecies, some more specific than others, many of which are said to have come to pass. For instance, she predicted that the ridge stones of the church being built at the time would never be placed. It seemed unlikely, as they were apparently already underway, but the boat delivering them was lost during a storm, and the stones sank to the bottom of the loch, never to be recovered. She also had a couple of prophecies regarding an ash tree that she planted, and next to which she was later buried. She said that when the tree grew as high as the gable of the church, that the church would split asunder. And the church roof did indeed collapse in 1833, when the height of the tree matched that of the church roof. The second prophecy regarding the tree was perhaps more of a curse. She made the rather ominous warning that evil will come to him who harms the ash tree. Apparently unconcerned by the warning, local farmer John Campbell cut down the tree in the 1870s. He was shortly gored to death by one of his bulls, and the horse that drew the cart that carried away the wood dropped dead in its field. So, prospective buyers beware, there are some as yet unfulfilled prophecies from the Lady of Laws, and those looking to buy their own slice of beautiful lochside property may find that they take on more than they bargained for. As usual, I'll put the article in the links on the show notes, as well as a few other links to more information about the Lady of Laws, which you can find on our website.
You had me at woodland and trout fishing rights before you even got to the ghosts.
Yeah, it does look beautiful. And if it wasn't for the fact that there was literally just tumble down ruins and there is nowhere to actually live as a person, I would have been sorely tempted.
Yeah, I still am sorely tempted, even with the lack of buildings.
We literally just had a conversation where I was like, bearing in mind that we do a podcast and there's no electricity, so we wouldn't be able to record and edit them. And Neil's like, I think we can find a way around
Solar
that.
power, man. Solar power. It'll be fine. I think Fitz wants a building to live in.
Yeah,
Practicalities.
I'm a little bit of a traditionalist like that.
You like a roof.
Yes.
There was so much about this story that I'd like to actually dig into this a little bit further. We may have to do that in future because it's a really interesting legend, I suppose you'd call it.
It was quite a fun one, and there are more prophecies yet as unfulfilled.
Oh,
so,
really? Oh, okay.
Potentially there's more that could happen.
Well, the other thing that stood out to me was the prophecy about the ash tree. It's just because I think in the Skulking Dudley episode, there was, again, a prophecy on an ash tree about it being cut down, or they weren't allowed, the villagers shouldn't have cut down this ash tree, and they did, and something awful befell them, and it's cropped up a lot. It's about the third time I've seen it recently, and I think I'll just have to look into it because it's obviously something of lore and legend where it's really unlucky to cut down an ash tree, but I don't know what that specific legend is. There must be something to it though, because it keeps coming up.
I hope there's not, because we've got an ash tree at the bottom of the garden that needs to come down.
We literally do. Okay, maybe we don't look into that. Perhaps ignorance is bliss.
And just to whet your appetite for the upcoming listener stories, we had a couple of comments come through on our Facebook group and our YouTube channel that we wanted to share with you. The first one is from Johanna.
I visited part of Hadrian's Wall on my solo drive from Brighton to Edinburgh, and as I sat on the wall and enjoyed the stunning scenery before me, I appreciated the peace and quiet. There was no one else around me, although there were people in a car park a 5 or so minute walk away. Suddenly, I heard the definite swoosh of an arrow being loosed from a bow. My son took archery lessons years ago, so I recognise the sound. I have absolutely no doubt what I heard. I stood up and looked all around me, but still could see nothing and nobody. It was very strange.
Very strange indeed, and it is a very distinctive sound. If any of you have done any form of archery, it is something that I don't think
you can't really mistake it for anything else.
No, it's kind of a sort of thwonk,
Yeah,
because you've got the slap of the string at the end, and yeah, it's a very distinctive noise that I think you would recognise if you heard it again.
And certainly, Hadrian's Wall, there's nothing really around, it's just open countryside. From my memories, I've only visited once briefly, but from my memories it was just wall and then nothing nothing either side. So I can't even think of what might have been around that could have made a noise like that.
No, and those that would have patrolled or assaulted the wall would most likely have been equipped with swords, spears and bows. And
oh, definitely. So very interesting. But also we've had similar. It reminded me, when I heard of Johanna's experience, it reminded me of when we were at a battlefield and we heard, again, just one single solitary disembodied sound that sounded like the of a cannon being lit.
Yeah, it was the sort of crackly fizz of a cannon fuse. Now, bear in mind that I haven't actually been on a cannon range or anything, so I'm relying on sort of TV and film so that I know what that sounds like.
You say that, but we have been at a lot of history reenactments where we've seen cannons being fired.
I'm aware of what it sounds like, and it sounded very, very similar to that, but I'm not going to say like
100%.
Yeah, these are sort of a few 5-minute instances years apart, so it's not like I used to go to archery once a week for 3 years.
But again, the reason it was so weird, even if it could have been something else, there wasn't anything else around. It was another situation of there was really nobody else there. Very similar, in fact.
We got there at closing time. It was like sort of there were 10 minutes to closing or something, so we were practically the only people left. I
think there was like another car in the car park, which was quite a distance away. But there was really nobody around. It, again, just open countryside and really nothing nearby. So it was more of a case of there was nothing to make the sound
Mm-hmm.
as much as anything else. So, yeah, very, very cool. And we have one more listener comment before we get stuck into today's stories. And this one was a comment on our YouTube video of our time slips episodes from Gullwing Storm.
They said, my mother was travelling upstairs in a double-decker bus in London in the late 50s when suddenly she was sitting on the top deck of an omnibus with several other people who were all in Victorian dress. As Mum looked round, all the streets had horse-drawn carriages and everyone was in long dresses. Mum tried to speak to the women near her, but it was as if they couldn't see her. It lasted about 5 minutes.
That is so cool. And I'm sure it must have been really weird and disconcerting, and your mum was probably freaked out, and that's completely fair enough. But honestly, that's the kind of experience I've been hoping to have since I was about 7 years old.
It was a really interesting experience, and I would love to have witnessed it. The only thing I will say is it doesn't seem to be a time slip as such, because the people couldn't see or interact with her, and that seems to be a common thing with these time slips, is that they can change things, affect things.
Wow, no, see, I don't know. I would class that as a time slip because it seems like she literally slipped out of her time and into somebody else's time.
Also, I wonder, because that period would have been a little bit more sort of decorous, and I wonder if they were just like, oh, she's not dressed properly.
Exactly.
I shan't speak to her.
Exactly. And also, back in those sort of times, you would have had more of a class system. So if that person was dressed in modern clothing, that might have been interpreted as, peasant clothing, shabby clothing, not good enough to be talking to those people. So I think, yeah, you may have a point there. It may have just been that they didn't want to acknowledge there was something weird happening.
Yeah, true. What would have been the clincher for that, as if she had appeared inside somebody else and she was like, oh, I'm sitting in the place that somebody else is sitting.
That's going to hurt my brain. That's enough of that. Let's not go down any rabbit holes before we even get started. And with that, why don't we get on to our first story of this episode? And this one is from Andy.
I've never told anyone this story for fear of being ridiculed. It happened when I was around 13 years old. I'd just started my first year of secondary school at an all-boys school. In the first term, the school sent the whole grade on a weekend camp in a bushland area. It was the classic outdoor adventure with horse riding, swimming, archery, and various activities designed to toughen up sheltered little boys. For kids who were just beginning at a new high school, where you didn't necessarily know anybody and had yet to make any friends, and where the supervisors were boys much older, bigger, hairier, and scarier, a weekend like this was both exciting and a little intimidating. At night, we slept in rough wooden, unheated and poorly lit cabins surrounded by bushland. Each cabin held about 15 kids, plus a leader, and had rows of heavy wooden double bunk beds with dirty plastic mattresses. The standard oversized and over-engineered dormitory bunks, built permanently into the walls of the cabin, are designed to stand up to years of punishment. Bunks so deep and wide, there's barely any elbow room in the central aisle of the cabin. The weirdness started late on the second night. We were all in bed shivering in our sleeping bags in the dark. It had reached that well-known after-midnight stage of bedtime at camp, and official lights out had been hours earlier. It was the second night, so everyone was exhausted and just wanted to collapse. All the horseplay and deodorant fights and dirty jokes and giggling had finished. Everyone was thoroughly fed up and irritated and just wanted everyone else to shut up so we could all go to sleep. Some kids were even a little bit homesick. I myself was a quiet kid, and at this point didn't feel either rebellious or homesick. I just sat quietly and curiously watched my new schoolmates, trying to work out who was who in the zoo. Of course, there was also that one kid who can't or won't be quiet, even when leaders threaten them with detentions and being sent outside to sleep on the deck. As 1 a.m. rolled around, the leaders, who had gotten out of bed several times, were beyond mere weary exasperation and getting to the point of being genuinely angry and threatening to strangle the next person who moved or made a sound. Finally, everything was quiet. Everyone had rolled over and a couple of kids had dropped off to sleep. I heaved a big sigh and started to drift off. It was at this point one kid yelled out, "Ow! Something hit me, turn on the lights." The reaction was a few groans. Some kids said shut up. The leaders pretended to be asleep and hoped it would go away, while a couple of kids who had instantly dropped off slept through the entire episode that was to follow. "It was a little rock or something," said the alarmed boy. When the lights went on, nothing could be found, and the lights immediately went off again. A minute later, there was another yell of, "Ow, something hit me," from the other side of the cabin. This time, all the lights went on. The leaders berated everyone, saying whatever was happening to cut it out and told the victim to calm down. What followed was an escalating sense of weirdness and anxiety, as for the next hour or so, people in different parts of the room were systematically pelted with tiny invisible objects. There was just enough time for the victim to stop whimpering and everyone to settle down again, thinking it was over, before it happened again. The leaders seemed to think we were just being silly, but the kids were genuinely scared. It didn't feel like we were getting pranked. It felt vicious and uncanny, and nobody could find any of the objects. I was not one of those who got hit, but I have a distinct memory of the kid in the bunk opposite me yelling, Hey, everyone, I've got one, get a light." I watched as he turned on his torch, looked confused when there was nothing in his hand, and then patted down the mattress trying to find it. I know an obvious skeptical explanation for all this is that an impish kid either inside the room or lurking outside the door or window was firing pellets at people with an elastic band or pea shooter, and of course this occurred to the people in the room, but was fairly soon discarded. When hearing a story like this, it's easy to dismiss people as having been fooled by an obvious prank, but you have to credit the reaction and intelligence of the people in the room at the time. Schoolboys are not dumb and are very familiar with all kinds of mischief. If there had been a perpetrator, they would have been easily identified and caught, and it really was inexplicable. Firstly, the room had all the doors and windows closed, so it couldn't have been someone creeping past and taking shots from outside. Secondly, it was dead silent until someone yelled, "Ouch!" The deep, motionless silence you get at night in the bush, far away from houses and roads and traffic noise, so quiet you can hear a duck quacking a mile away. In that silence, you could have easily heard the sound of someone shifting around in a bunk and sitting up to take a shot, or the twang of a pea shooter or slingshot. You'd also hear the sound of ricochets from missed shots and pellets bouncing on the floor. Most of all, you'd hear repressed snorting and sniggering from the perpetrator scoring a hit, and then everyone would have a laugh and pounded them. Thirdly, and most significantly, it was geometrically impossible. Boys were getting hit in both top and bottom bunks on both sides of the aisle, and up and down the length of the long and narrow cabin. It's physically impossible for a prankster to hit someone in a bunk above or below them. In fact, you'd be lucky to hit an exposed bit of skin hard enough to hurt in the dark unless you were aiming at the kid directly opposite. Could it have been the leaders playing mind games and shooting the kids for laughs? Even if a leader didn't care about sleep or camp rules and they were only pretending to act angry, and they really wanted to stir up the cabin and spend the entire night doing riot control, they still wouldn't have been able to zap that number of people without getting caught. Fourthly, as I already mentioned, this episode came immediately after a lot of joking and general horseplay. there was no reason for the vibe to change the way it did. If someone had been messing around with us, it would have just continued the mischief and mockery. Instead, it felt nasty and alarming. Nobody likes being struck in the dark. Nobody laughed. We just cowered in our thin sleeping bags, feeling vulnerable and creeped out. The final compelling factor for me in this is that none of the objects could be found, not in the night and not in the morning. Those hard little projectiles hit their target and disappeared with no physical trace. Schoolboys are obsessed with homemade projectiles, and let me tell you, if they can't find anything, there's nothing to be found. So what do I think it was? It was definitely something uncanny, but it never occurred to me to attribute it to a ghost or spirit. I had no sense of a presence or personality behind it, and why should there be necessarily? If I were pressed for a supernatural explanation at the time, when my impressions were fresh, I would have said it was tiny objects moving by themselves. If I was pressed now and used longer words and a bit of imagination, my best theory would be that there was a concentration of crude elemental energy in that specific area, which had been disrupted by a bunch of agitated hormonal kids making a lot of psychic disturbance, and the force reacted by striking out, in the same way that wasps mindlessly attack someone who bumps their nest. Wow, now I've got a new word entry for the paranormal dictionary: etheric wasps. I've enjoyed putting this story on paper and reflecting on it, but I remain as baffled as when I started.
Thank you so much to Andy for sharing that story with us. Etheric wasp. I love etheric wasp. It's definitely going in our paranormal vocabulary.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard of anything like that before.
No, I mean, the one thing it reminded me of in a way is that poltergeist story from, I think it was Wales, we covered quite a while ago now, where they had stones being thrown. Now, I know in this case there were no physical objects to be found, which is just another level of weirdness. But it just reminded me of the way they were just being sort of pinged around everywhere, because that's what was happening in this poltergeist case. And the stones appeared from nowhere and were pinged across the room. So they could find them afterwards, but they were coming from nowhere. They were just appearing.
Yeah, like you say, I've heard of that sort of thing before, things being thrown at people, but you tend to be able to find what it is that was thrown. And in a lot of cases, there's that feeling, that sort of ominous, that presence feeling that, you're being targeted. Whereas this almost seems indistinct. It's like not specifically targeted at someone. It's just lashing out.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it is lashing out at the boys specifically because, like he says, they're hitting their mark. If that was a person, there's no way in a dark room in a bunk from one location you could hit people that accurately. You just couldn't do it. You'd have to be a master marksman.
I must admit, I'm more convinced by the fact that, like he says, you can hear everything. Because, when it's quiet at night, it's dark, you can hear a lot more than you even would think during the day.
Yeah, when you're away from the town or the city, you don't realise how much sometimes in the town and city that everything is muffled because there's a background noise. You just tune it out, in your conscious mind. But when you get out to somewhere that's that remote, you suddenly, the silence is loud almost.
Yeah. Well, even here, when you've got traffic noise outside and things like that, I can hear when the cat shuffles on the bed and things like that you wouldn't normally necessarily hear. And if someone was manoeuvring to get shots at everybody, you'd hear it.
Oh, you'd hear it so loudly in a situation like that. So, I do think he's onto something. It does sound very poltergeisty to me. And that's not to say I think that the cabin was haunted by a poltergeist. It's just that kind of energy. I mean, a poltergeist, is classically thought of to be produced by human energy. So it's not a haunting.
And teenagers specifically, they tend to be the focus, and now you've got a whole cabin full of them.
And also they're not just, it's not just the teenage energy that you've got going on there, but they're out of place, they're away from home. There's so many different emotions going on there. Kids will be, out of their depth, they'll be homesick, they'll be frustrated, they'll be lonely, they'll be scared. And oftentimes, we've talked about this quite a lot, is just being in either the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. There are some cases where you've got people in a location that have lived there for years and they've never experienced anything at all. And then a new family come in, all hell breaks loose.
Mm-hmm.
And there does seem to be an element of needing to have the right person kind of kickstart that energy, ignite something.
That and change. Like a big thing that seems to come up a lot is when people do renovations and things, they're making
Yes.
changes. And these are sort of new bunches of kids each time they have a camp and stuff. So you've got that sort of change element there as well.
Yeah, definitely. But really, really interesting case.
The perfect storm.
Yeah.
Well, as well as the perfect storm and etheric wasps, Andy actually provided a second story. This one is a bit of a blooper, but it was a really, really good one, and I hope you enjoy it.
I had a student job working the late night packing shift in a large department store. This might not sound like the setting for the paranormal, but there's nothing as spooky as a department store when it's completely empty in the middle of the night. There's something about places that are normally busy with people and noise and activity when they're completely deserted that makes them feel creepier than a haunted house, despite everything being clean, new, colourful and brightly lit. The parts of the store never seen by the public were also spooky, but in a more mundane way. Dirty, cold, undecorated, dark and industrial, with layers of thick paint, exposed pipes, padlocked wire cages and weird smells. The back dock was like an underworld, a narrow maze with high ceiling, the occasional painfully bright lights ironically creating even starker, dark shadows everywhere. Shelves only accessible by forklift and many areas out of sight, so you were never sure what was just around the corner. You'd never spend too long in there, just a glance at the clock on the time card machine to get some sense of time in the real world, and then bolt. My job was breaking down stock from pallets in the warehouse, loading the boxes into cages on wheels, rolling them out to the floor, opening them and stacking the goods on shelves. This went on until the early hours of the morning. My colleagues were the usual bunch of adorable misfits, and we were almost entirely unsupervised. Staffing was surprisingly thin, often only one person per department, and it was not unusual to go for an hour or two without seeing another soul. Nights felt timeless and totally surreal. We weren't permitted to wear headphones, so it was either chilling silence or horrible piped top 40 music, which inexplicably went on and off at different times, or mechanical moans and groans from the warehouse. It was on just such one of these lonely nights, while I was arranging items on a shelf, that I heard a strange, faint sound coming from somewhere a few aisles down. It sounded like a child's voice talking. There was silence, and then a minute later I heard it again. It was a sing-song voice like you'd hear a kid do while skipping happily around with their mum and dad on a Saturday during afternoon shopping. But of course, there were no customers in the store. I put down what I was doing and went to the end of the aisle to investigate. As I walked closer to what I thought was the source of the sound, I heard the voice again. It was unmistakably a female child's voice, saying in a quiet but clear sing-song voice, "I can see you," which echoed around the shelves. It's hard to describe how it sounded, but the word "see" was pitched and drawn out. "I can see you," which made it sound incredibly ominous, as though I'd been caught doing something shameful and retribution was about to follow. I immediately felt cold in my stomach and began unconsciously holding my breath, that paralysis you get when you don't know what's happening. The voice seemed to be coming from 2 aisles over, where there was a large central aisle running down the length of the store, terminating in thick translucent plastic swinging flaps that led to the back dock. There it was again, And this time I could hear not just one voice, but what sounded like a chorus of small children, all whispering the same phrase, "Peekaboo, I can see you," the sounds overlapping slightly. My horror increased yet again with what I heard next, or imagined that I heard. I reached the endmost aisle, and whatever it was on the other side. I had to either step out and look at it or run. And then the hellish choir rang out once more. This time, beneath the children's voices, I could now hear another set of voices, much deeper, growling the same phrase. Deep, distorted, demonic-sounding voices, speaking with such guttural slowness that you could hear the glutinous, "I can see you," trailing on long after all the child's voices had stopped. I felt like I was going to throw up. It was literally something out of a horror movie. As I rounded the corner, I saw one of my colleagues on a high ladder. Below him was an entire trolley full of battery-powered, talking doll soft toys. They were obviously activated by pressure, and each time he threw another doll into the trolley from the top of the ladder, it set off the whole pile. As I watched, he threw a doll with some force into the trolley, and the whole lot bounced and went off. Clearly, they were old stock, and a number of them had batteries that were running out. The demonic voices? As happens with older battery-powered talking toys, half-dead batteries make the electronic speech deeper, slower, and more distorted. Sometimes it starts normally and gets rapidly slower and deeper as the weak charge in the battery fails. "Do you know what that sounds like from over there?" I exclaimed. "Are you trying to give me a heart attack? That's the creepiest thing I've ever heard. I can see why nobody wants to buy these." Needless to say, both of us had a good laugh, rolled our eyes at the absurdity of the mass consumerism, and got back to work. I wish they had smartphones back in those days, because it would have made an absolutely cracking video to post on social media. As such, it will just be another addition to my list of fond memories of the daily bizarre things that happen after hours in a department store.
And thank you to Andy for sharing both of those stories with us. I do need to say before we say anything else, they were both fantastically written. I love the etheric wasps. I love the hellish choirs.
Oh yes, that was brilliant. They were amazing.
But that, I think, is possibly my favourite paranormal blooper so far. I mean, with these dolls, these battery-powered dolls, they're scary enough at the best of times.
Oh, absolutely. Even with a full set of batteries, they are the stuff of nightmares.
But yeah, if you add in a whole crate of them and some of them sort of with failing batteries and no,
nobody nope.
I'd have noped out of there as well, I think. I normally have a fairly strong tolerance to this sort of thing. Like if we get a weird noise or see something, I'm like, oh, what's that? And I'm going to have a look. But that, I think
If I'd have heard that, I would have left my shift.
Yeah, I think I'd have just been like, nope,
knock myself right out of there. We do love a good paranormal blooper. We haven't had them in a while, actually. If anybody else has got any paranormal bloopers, we love sharing them, because you can't take yourself too seriously in this field. You know, there's times to be serious, but you've got to have a laugh along the way, because there's stuff like this that happens and it's part of the ride.
Yeah, and sometimes, like, the difference between a paranormal story and a paranormal blooper is just perspective. Like, if he'd have done that, if he'd just said, oh, nope, I'm noping out of there, that would have been a terrifying story, wouldn't it? Yeah. Can you imagine he hadn't looked and he just like, I was working in the warehouse at night in the dark and I suddenly heard these children's voices going, I can see you. Yep, that would have been a terrifying paranormal story.
Oh my God, I would have loved to have seen the video of that. I really would. Well, this next one is not a blooper, but it is really interesting, and this one is from Selena.
About 10 years ago, I bought a vintage bag from a shop in the Spitalfields area in East London. I was really into vintage clothes back then, and little did I know what I'd let myself in for. The bag was one of those generic 1950s style black patent square ones with a gold clasp opening and a small handle. The kind you see old ladies wearing in old footage from the time. Everything was fine for a few days, And then it started to happen. One night, as I'd just gone to bed, but not yet fallen asleep, my bed started shaking, almost an indiscernible amount. This had never happened before, and I thought I must be imagining it, so I just went to sleep. I was woken at around 3 a.m. that same night, this time by more vigorous shaking. It lasted for about 2 minutes, and I just hid under the covers out of fear. I know some people will say that it was sleep paralysis, but I've experienced sleep paralysis and it felt nothing like that. I'd fully awoken, and I could move and talk should I have wanted to while the shaking was happening. I was living with my mum at the time, but didn't want to mention it to her as I thought she'd think I just dreamt it. Over the next week, it happened almost every night, sometimes several times a night, and this is when I realised there must be something attached to the bag. The last time that it happened, I was at my wit's end, so I woke up my mum in the early hours, told her what was happening, and she came in and slept in my room with me that night. She decided to swear at whatever it was and told them to leave me alone. It didn't happen again that night. The next day, tired and fed up with the situation, I decided to get rid of the bag. I threw it in a public bin. The majority of the shaking stopped after that. I very occasionally have it still happen to this day. I live in another house now. I don't know if it's still the same entity that's travelled with me, or if this is something else. After that experience, I never bought anything vintage again.
And thank you so much to Selena for sharing that story. Now, I must admit, I'm with you. I used to collect quite a lot of vintage pieces, furniture, items, stuff from charity shops, and the more we've been doing this show and having visited places like the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre, I have definitely slowed down on buying secondhand things when I don't know their backstory.
See, I think I'd be more inclined to get something like that now.
No, that's actually a very good point. I think we've kind of come out the other side of it now, because I think when we first started the show for the first few years, I just became very aware of, we have had experiences where we have literally, well, I have, where I've actually had to get rid of items. And one of them wasn't even vintage. It wasn't secondhand. It was brand new, but it seemed to have something of the location attached to it that I bought it from, even though it was a new item. My mum has had a couple of occasions, even though she's not a paranormal person, she normally doesn't want to know, doesn't want to think about it. She gets very scared, so she just kind of pretends it's all not going on. But she's had a couple of things that I think, one of them at least, she bought from a car boot sale, and she had some really weird stuff started to happen. She had to get rid of the object. I believe that went in a public bin as well. Nowadays, I think we've come out the other side of it. I think if I saw something I thought was haunted, I might be tempted to rehome it here.
I'd be tempted now.
But we'd treat it a bit differently. I think we wouldn't be scared of it in the same way, and we'd try and sort of communicate with it. So there's lots of different ways of looking at it. But yeah, I've definitely been on that side of it. I've definitely had to to get rid of items in public bins in the past.
Yeah, what I found interesting about this one was it almost seemed like a battery as opposed to what was causing it, because when she got rid of it, it still happened a little bit afterwards.
Yeah.
So whether something had attached to her from the bag and continued, but it was almost like it was there anyway, and it couldn't do anything until you brought the bag, and the bag was like a sort of spooky battery.
Oh, I see what you mean. So just possibly there was something waiting to be ignited, and then again we're down to what we discussed in the last.
This is pure speculation. I wouldn't like to say this is what happened. It just seemed odd that even though she got rid of the bag, there was still some things happening, and it's still happening, just not as frequently.
Well, you could look at it that way, but you could also look at it that something came with the bag and didn't necessarily leave with the bag. I wonder if it wasn't as much of getting rid of the bag that stopped it and calmed it down as much as her mum telling it to stop.
Yeah, true.
Because we have had, again, experience with that in the past. And it's a bit of advice that we've heard from a lot of paranormal investigators, and we would probably stand by ourselves.
Yeah.
If you've got something happening, just try talking to it. And we've said that out loud in our house sometimes. Can you please bring back my item that's gone missing? Can you please stop stomping around? Or, vice versa. Can you please talk to us? You'd be surprised how often just being really firm and saying, no, this is my space. I do not want you to do that. You're upsetting me. I can't
not in a nasty way, but I think in this case, like in a mum way, like you can pack that in right now.
Yeah, stop. You do not upset my child.
Yes. It's not a sort of, an aggressive, I'm going to hurt you. It's just, you can pack that in because you're being a naughty child.
It's setting boundaries, isn't it? There's a lot to be said for setting boundaries with everything. And I wonder whether it wasn't necessarily getting rid of the bag as much as the boundary setting.
Quite possibly. Interesting take. Well, now it is time for our last listener story this episode, and this one is from Holly.
This experience happened at a time when I lived in a townhouse with one roommate. She happened to be out of state for a freelance project for a few weeks. I'd recently lost a job and was feeling incredibly uninspired. We're both artists, and I really needed to kick myself into gear to create new work for my portfolio. Having some time alone to let those creative juices flow was exactly what I needed, but something had other plans in store for me. A little more background information before we get into the meat of the story. Before leaving my last job, an incredibly generous mentor of mine gifted me his old Cintiq, a massive computer monitor I could draw on that cost thousands of dollars I simply didn't have. Unfortunately, the piece of equipment was rather old, so it was not long for this world. When it finally kicked the bucket, I didn't know what to do with it, so I was resigned to temporarily storing the massive monitor under my desk in my tiny bedroom. So one day, after a lot of weird electrical issues, the fire alarm in my bedroom kept going off for no reason, even though the landlord came and checked it twice, and there were no issues to be found. And I was having no luck inspiration-wise. I turned in early for the night. I hoped some good sleep and good dreams would help give me the fresh start I needed the next morning, but I just kept waking up feeling watched. The first time I woke up, I felt something near me and turned over to see that at the end of the bed there was a bowling ball-sized, semi-transparent, yellowish orb, just floating. It sounds crazy, I know, but it moved from the end of my bed and crawled behind my pillow. Freaky. But I thought, whatever, and went back to sleep. I woke up again. I had the same sensation of something watching me, and I want to express that this was definitely not sleep paralysis. I was awake and moving around. This time when I turned over and looked, it was a smaller, darker orange orb. It also floated to my pillow and disappeared. Really freaky. But I was exhausted, so again I thought, whatever. Although this time I turned on the light on my nightstand before going back to sleep. I woke up again. This time there was a smaller, darker, red orb about the size of a golf ball. I can't remember if it floated behind my pillow like the others, to be honest, but by this point I was properly freaked out. I decided to sleep downstairs on the couch instead of risking another encounter in my bed. Once I'd swaddled myself up in blankets downstairs, I stayed up for a while watching Doctor Who, trying to unfreak myself out. But eventually I started drifting back to sleep, and in that fuzzy twilight state between awake and asleep, I started getting a really awful feeling. There's no way to describe it except heavy and full of dread and frustration. And then I got this funny, intrusive thought. Why is she just leaving that broken TV under her desk? It felt so angry and so confused. And I thought to myself, waking up a bit, that's weird. Why did I think that? I don't have a TV under my desk. I don't even own a TV. And then that awful feeling came back, and I had the realization that that thought didn't come from me. It wasn't mine. And then a different kind of dread and panic filled me as a deep instinctual part of me screamed I shouldn't even acknowledge that wasn't my thought. And as I'm having these horrific realizations, I started experiencing the terrible, oppressive sleep paralysis sensation of something suddenly pressing down on my chest and neck. Long story short, I managed to fight that feeling off. I did not sleep the rest of the night, and I kept thinking about that weird thought because I don't own a TV. I certainly don't have a broken one under my desk. And it didn't hit me until the next morning that the broken Cintiq looks like a TV. I'm convinced this wasn't just me freaking myself out, because it took me hours to put two and two together that the TV in question was likely in reference to the large computer monitor in my room. After a while, I looked up orb colour meanings. It was a cursory Google search, to be completely fair, and to this day, I don't even know if I believe in orbs despite my experiences. I believe in so many things, and yet that's still one of the ones I have reservations about. But apparently, yellows, oranges and reds can signify warnings, omens or protection. And it just strikes me as so freaky that it wasn't until I left my room that the real unpleasantness started. Between the fire alarm in my room that day and the potentially warning orbs, it really feels like I was being warned about a particularly unpleasant guest sharing this space with me.
And thank you to Holly for sharing that story with us. That was quite an interesting one, and it was quite amusing that you would I didn't even twig that they were talking about this monitor when they were talking about a TV.
Well, no, why would you? Because, we have probably a different image of a TV. This might have been somebody who had a different vision of what a TV was. I mean, when you think about how TVs have changed in appearance, even since we've been together, I mean, our first TV was gigantic. Yeah. Oh my goodness, it was a beast, and I'll never forget carrying that up 3 flights of stairs.
Yeah, it was a bit of a monster.
Well, Holly actually wrote in this story, particularly in reference to our recent Crisis Apparitions episode, and she mentions that we talk in that episode about having that spidey sense and not being able to turn it off. I think I was talking about, it must be really difficult to have these kind of premonition type feelings and just not be able to do anything about them necessarily. And what do you do if you have to deal with that every day, basically? You can't turn it off. And it does sound like Holly's had an experience of that here, that kind of, that spidey sense, that tuning into something that's going on in the surroundings, having thoughts that weren't hers pop into her head. And I feel like almost in a way, we kind of in a roundabout sense touched on this a little bit in our last episode with the extended memory recall experiment, because that's almost like an artificial way of deliberately tuning in to what's going on in the background and what's going on in your surroundings. But funnily enough, the other reason I wanted to talk about this was because it's kind of like relevant in capital letters, because I had an experience that feels along the same lines of this myself recently. It was very weird and I wanted to share it. So I was just going about my day, normal working day, and I started having a panic attack. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I have panic attacks, I do suffer from them, and they can come out of the blue. But for some reason, I knew this was not my panic attack. In a logical sense, because usually, even though they hit you out of the blue, you can trace it back, even in the moment, to, okay, it makes sense because this has been happening. But there was nothing. It was more than that, though. I just knew it wasn't mine, even though I was having the physical symptoms. And something just popped into my head that I needed to ring my mum. It was my mum that was having the panic attack. And I was experiencing it simultaneously. And I knew that it wasn't mine. It's never happened to me before. It was the weirdest thing. And I think if we hadn't talked about this kind of stuff recently on the show, I wouldn't have listened to that little voice that went, ring your mum. So in that case, when we were talking about the Crisis Apparitions episode and I was saying, it must be awful to not be able to tune that out. I still stand by that in a way, because that would be exhausting to be on and tuned into that all the time. But then I was kind of thinking along the lines of, well, you can't do anything about it. But in this case, I could help, listening to that voice, I was able to do something about it. So that has changed my perspective. Although having said that, you would definitely want a way to be able to sort of deliberately tuned that out so it's not happening all the time, because that would just be confusing and exhausting. The other thing was the orbs. I've got to admit, I'm with Holly. I know people personally that have had experiences where they have seen orbs with their naked eye, and I do think that is something different to orbs caught on camera.
Mm-hmm.
If you catch an orb on camera, like, I almost guarantee you it's dust, it's moisture in the air. I say that because I've seen it happen on camera. I remember so clearly, it was the first paranormal postcard we ever did, and I was in Leicester Guildhall, I think. And I had my camera in front of me, my phone camera. So obviously I was looking through the screen essentially. And I watched with my naked eyes a fleck of dust drift past me in this sort of dank place. And I saw the effect that it made on the camera, and it literally looked exactly like an orb. And I remember seeing it, and that just kind of cleared it in my head.
Yeah, and there was also the what we thought were footsteps, but were lens flare from the chandelier.
We learned a lot on that trip.
Yeah.
But, like I say, I know people that have seen
a
lights.
bowling ball-sized glowing thing.
That is a different thing.
Yeah, that's something else entirely.
That if you're seeing that with your naked eye, something else is going on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wouldn't put my name behind orbs, but a disembodied, glowing, a self-illuminating, sorry, that's a better word, ball of light that you're seeing with your naked eyes is something different entirely. I mean, I think we need a different classification for that doesn't come under the umbrella of orb. And I know other people that have seen them as well. So yeah, I don't know what they are, but I think that's something else aside from orbs that's going on.
And that, I'm afraid, is all the listener stories for this episode. Thank you so much to all of you that shared your experiences. We absolutely love hearing them and, of course, sharing them, which is what the show is all about. We are always looking for more of people's paranormal encounters, so if you've experienced something spooky, then please do get in touch to share your story through our website at notonceVS.com.
As we always say, your stories are the backbone of the podcast and the reason we do the show. And looking forward for the months ahead, we don't actually have a huge stash of them to draw on. So if you have a story, or if you have a friend who'd be happy to share one, please do introduce them to the show and spread the word, because you'd be doing us a huge favour. As always, if you have sent in a story and we haven't used it yet, please don't worry. As Fitz says, I have a rather arcane method of choosing the stories. But we do read every single story that is sent in to us. Sometimes just takes us a bit of a while to find the perfect fit in the right episode.
But now it is time to head to the coast and visit the Roman fort of Burgh Castle.
Yes, and before we get started, if you are our patron and you have seen our vlog of Burgh Castle, we apologise that we pronounced it incorrectly, which is not like us. We usually check so hard. In our defence, Norfolk place names are notorious, and I think anybody that lived in Norfolk would heartily agree with us. For example, when we went to Haysborough, we were forewarned of that one, but if you read Haysborough written down, it is spelt Happysburg. There's no way you'd look at it and think it was pronounced Haysborough. In addition to that, when we did get home and we realised we'd probably done a boo-boo, I went on to a local Norfolk Facebook page and I asked the locals of Burgh Castle how you pronounce the name Burgh Castle, and I'm not kidding you, I got 5 different responses. Even the locals couldn't agree how to pronounce it. So yeah, apologies for that. Our mistake. Norfolk place names, if you want to check them before you say them out loud. But after much research, we have come to the conclusion that we're pretty sure that it should be pronounced Burgh Castle. So that's what we'll be using from now on.
And like a startling number of place names in the UK, the meaning of the word borough or burgh is a fortification or fortified settlement. So you're effectively saying castle, castle.
Castle, 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 yeah.
And I think there's a hill in Britain somewhere that's like Tor, blah, blah, blah. And it's all the different languages names for hill.
It's got
so
like the
hill,
English
hill,
name
hill,
for
hill,
hill,
hill, hill.
The Welsh name for hill, the something like the Old English name for hill, and then something else. And yeah, it's like hill, 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 hill. There's a river like that as well. I think there's like river, river, river. Gotta love the English language.
Indeed. So we went to Castle Castle, which at the time wasn't a castle, it was a fort. But as you will find out, at one point it was a castle, so it's not entirely undeserved.
Well, first of all, as we were planning to make the 200-mile round trip to the coast anyway, we couldn't resist diverting just a few miles north to pop in on our old favourite haunt of Haysborough, the aforementioned Haysborough, the wild, windswept bit of Norfolk that's become our happy place since our sunrise visit there for an episode we did last year. We parked the coffee-mobile on the cliffs overlooking the gorgeous beach, a strong coastal breeze buffeting the van as we huddled in the back, indulging in a breakfast of fresh seafood from the local fishmongers. With bellies full of whelks, cockles and crayfish, we scampered down the steep cliff access for a quick and very bracing paddle in the ever-chilly North Sea, filling our lungs with fresh salty air before tracking sandy footprints back to the van, refreshing the coffee flasks and heading off on our next stop of the day, a haunted Roman fort. I hadn't really looked at the route planner that much before setting off, and had expected the sat-nav to take us on a pleasant scenic drive along the coast road, the narrow A road that skirts along the edge of the Norfolk coastline, often with postcard pretty views of the sea. But instead, the route took us away from the sea and into the Norfolk countryside, and it felt a little strange driving back inland to visit a site famously known as a Saxon shore fort.
This title may be a little misleading. As already mentioned, this was a Roman fort, not Saxon, but during Britain's time of Roman occupation, all the settlements along this stretch of coastline were open to attack by invaders from across the North Sea, and so the Romans built a chain of fortifications along the coast to defend their territory. These fortifications served to protect against Saxon invaders during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, and as such they became known as the Forts of the Saxon Shore. In fact, Burgh Castle wasn't the only Roman fortification on this stretch of coastline. The remains of another fort can be seen at the nearby seaside town of Caister-on-Sea. You might think this was a better contender for protecting the coast against Saxon raiding ships, with it at least being quite a bit nearer the sea, but even this is nearly a mile inland, and that's not taking into account the significant coastal erosion that's destroyed miles of coastline over time. Entire villages have been lost to the sea, even in the last few decades, let alone during the 2,000-odd years since the Romans came to Britain. Even more confusingly, at the village of Reedham, some 7 miles inland from the sea, archaeologists may have discovered evidence to suggest that the local church of St. John the Baptist started its life as a Roman lighthouse or pharos. Historians have had their suspicions about the church for many years, due to the fact that Roman building materials and tile could be seen within the walls of the church, giving a big clue that some of the masonry used in the structure had been scavenged from an abandoned Roman building. In addition to the lighthouse theory, historians think the site may once have been a fortlet, a sort of mini fort, possibly used to protect military supplies bound for Hadrian's Wall at the north frontier of the Roman Empire. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar and small test trenches have uncovered more clues to the former Roman use of this site, suggesting that these ideas may well have a basis in fact. So, what on earth would a Roman lighthouse be doing over 7 miles inland? Well, I couldn't really wrap my head around this either, until I managed to track down a map of this section of the Norfolk coastline as it would have appeared in Roman times, and discovered that one of Norfolk's most famous seaside towns didn't even exist at that time. And I don't mean that it just hadn't been settled, I mean that there was no land to settle. The location that would one day become Great Yarmouth was under the sea, and there was a huge and watery gap in the coastline we know today. The landscape at that time was very different, carved out by the paths of 3 rivers on one side and the sea on the other, which broke through the coastline in several places, creating small islands. Across East Anglia, the rivers Yar, Bure and Waveney crept ever eastwards towards the coast, all 3 eventually meeting in a great confluence, where our missing modern town would one day lie, creating a huge estuary that emptied into the North Sea. You can imagine why this would have been an important place for trade. The estuary must have provided the perfect harbour for incoming merchants trading by sea, and in the 3rd and 4th centuries, there would have been a lot of overseas trade through the connections of the Roman Empire. Doubtless, the smaller among these ships will have used this as an access point to continue up any of the 3 main rivers to take their wares inland. But of course, all this comes with the risk that raiders will use these very same channels for their own nefarious means. Suddenly, the positions of the Roman fortifications and lighthouse made much more sense. The forts at Caister-on-Sea and Burgh Castle were situated on either side of the Roman Great Estuary, whilst the fortlet and potentially lighthouse at Reedham watched over the far end of the estuary and the access points to the rivers. The fortlet was sited right at the head of the River Yar, and no wonder they wanted one last protective measure at this river access. Tracing the Yar's curve inland, it doesn't take long until I find Venta Icenorium marked on the map, once the capital of the Iceni tribe and base of the infamous Boudica. Even after the Iceni's rebellion was defeated, this East Anglian capital remained an important town, and the Romans would have had every reason to want to go belt and braces, stopping any potential raiders before they even entered the river leading to it. Pulling up in the car park of the rather inland castle today, however, it was quite difficult to imagine that this place once overlooked the sea. But Burgh Castle had many surprises in store for us today, and we would get a small glimpse into the fort's past after all.
On a map, you might see the fort located under its present name, or you might see it given its full Roman title of Gariononum. To confuse things slightly, the small Norfolk village in which the fort resides is also called Burgh Castle. Both sit at a confluence of the rivers Yar and Waveney, just a small remaining nod to the great confluence of 3 rivers that fed the estuary here 2 millennia ago. Leaving the car, we headed into the peaceful English countryside. The sun had made an appearance and beat down on us, bathing the surrounding fields in a warm, dusty haze, hinting at lazy summer days to come. Feeling lulled by the sunshine and quite probably bellies full of seafood, we didn't pay much attention to looking for directions, simply ambling off in what seemed like the right direction and yet to see our first glimpse of the fort. We didn't know it at the time, but there are a couple of main ways into the fort. I suspect most people will take the route that brings you to the front of the fort, the path leading right up to Gariononum's impressive east gate, where, back in the 4th century, Roman cavalrymen from the Equites Stablesiani unit would have come and gone from the garrison on their horseback patrols. Archaeological excavations of the area uncovered part of a Roman cavalryman's helmet dating to around 350 AD, with an inscription inside that read Stablesiana 6. It's thought that the fort would have housed up to 500 mounted soldiers and their horses. This wasn't some backwater outpost. This fort was a serious undertaking. Visitors arriving at this main entrance will immediately be wowed by the scale of this place, viewing the full width of the fort's east wall in all its glory as they approach. But us, being us, didn't go that way. Instead, we meandered down the footpath across the neighbouring field, heading towards the valley of the River Waveney, where at the end of the path we reached a lookout point. Now, we may have taken the route slightly less travelled, but it's honestly the one I'd recommend to anyone visiting. Standing at this lookout point, we could take in views across the confluence of the rivers Waveney and Yar, with the Braden Water Nature Reserve beyond, and a helpful information board explaining how this vista would have once looked out across the great estuary in Roman times. Of course, it's nothing like the expanse of water that the Romans would have seen. Long ago, it silted up and largely became part of the marshy fenland so famous in this part of the country. But in the flat East Anglian landscape with boats chugging back and forth across the water, it certainly gives you a taste of the landscape that once was. From here, we followed a dirt path towards a gap in the hedgerow, beyond which we could just see our first glimpse of the fort's walls coming into view, the leafy screen lending a mystery to the unveiling of what we were to find beyond. And, stepping through, we found an epic ruin, of proportions only the Romans could have left, and we hadn't even seen the full extent of it yet. We entered at the corner of the north wall, and so we could only see the shortest stretch of the fort's full scale, but even that was impressive enough. An impenetrably thick stone wall of split flint and alternating bands of red tile loomed 15 feet high above us, the length of the wall punctuated by 2 round tower bastions, one of which had broken away from the main wall. At this end, mounded earth had been built up nearly 2/3 of the height of the wall and tower, presumably to shore up the broken structure. But with the bastion leaning away from its housing, it gave the impression that the tower was taking a creepingly slow, centuries-long slide down the hill. The benefit of this mounded earth for us was that it meant you could actually get almost to the top of the high wall at this end. There was even a flight of narrow wooden steps cut into the slope in the far corner, probably to stop overly keen people, like us, scrambling up the slope and damaging the earthworks. This was quite a treat. You have to understand that there aren't really that many Roman buildings as intact as this left in the UK, and I'm not sure that there's anywhere else where you can ascend to nearly the level at which Roman soldiers would have stood once on watch, and get a glimpse of the vista that those soldiers stationed here would have seen. We clambered up the wooden steps and found that there wasn't really much room to spare at the top, especially for 2 people wielding rucksacks and simultaneously trying to film video. And a bit of manoeuvring ensued as we tried to get out of each other's way. But this had the curious effect of almost instantaneously immersing me in the atmosphere and the history of the place. At the top of the steps, I came rather abruptly face to face with the top of the wall. Now, walls are something you really tend to look at from afar. You take in the whole structure, the building it's part of. I can't say that I normally stick my nose up against any walls, however historical, in quite the manner I did while catching my breath and my balance at the top of those steps. But forced to quite literally come nose to nose with it, I was struck like a punch to the guts with just how ancient it was and how tangible was that ancient history right here in front of me. No matter how many heritage sites we visit, the people of Britain's past often seem far away in the distant, half-imagined mists of time. It can be difficult to feel like they were real flesh and blood, sweat and dirt people, especially when you're talking about a past as distant as 400 AD. But as I pressed my hand against this wall, could smell the earthy, chalky scent of it, I felt a connection to those people that it's difficult to understand and even harder to explain. Over 1,700 years ago, a Roman builder had picked up these very same pieces of flint and tile that my hand rested on now, and they made them into this wall. I wonder if they could have had any idea how long these walls would stand, or how the world would have changed in that time. I felt as though I could blink and I would lose the 21st century entirely. It wouldn't have surprised me to have heard the clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones or the distant chinking of armour. Snapping out of it slightly, I turned to inch round the end of the wall and see what lay behind it. But in doing so, I turned west, to the direction of the river valley, where the grounds of the fort dropped off steeply to the river below. If I peeked out through the trees, I could see the view out across what had once been the Roman estuary, and this only served to heighten the sense of that ancient landscape being but one blink away, as the flat East Anglian landscape meant you could see for miles, the horizon stretching on seemingly forever. From this viewpoint, it suddenly wasn't so hard to imagine seeing those merchant ships passing by on their way upriver, or to imagine a weary Roman soldier pacing this wall, squinting into the fading light for unwelcome signs of raiders. The section of the wall ends abruptly here because the whole length of the west wall of the fort has gone, collapsed and fallen down into the valley and the waters below many, many centuries ago. But it's here, looking out over the landscape of the ancient estuary and the river valley below the castle, that seems to be the focus for many of Burgh Castle's ghost stories.
Of course, the waterfront here must have been the scene of some of the most dramatic moments of the fort's history. After all, the structure's whole purpose was to defend against enemies riding the incoming tides, and the resultant clashes would have resounded across the estuary. The air ringing with the sound of sword on sword, the heavy thunk of battle axes deflected by solid wooden shields, the crash of armoured bodies colliding, the screamed orders and howling battle cries let loose into air thick with the stench of fear, sweat, and blood. Those frantic and desperate moments must have wrought an energy and memory powerful enough to weather the centuries, almost as well as those thick, impenetrable Roman walls. Because on the 27th of April each year, it's said that the sounds of battle are replayed once more, blood-curdling cries cutting through the mists rising off the still marshland of the Norfolk Broads, as though the memory of the battle itself is escaping and rising from its watery grave in the ghost of the ancient estuary. But this isn't the only ghostly secret that's hidden within these marshy waters. It seems as though Burgh Castle particularly lends itself to anniversary ghosts. Perhaps the most pure examples of the stone tape theory, thought to be caused by events so traumatic that they've etched themselves on their surroundings, doomed to repeat themselves year after year on the date of their occurrence. The theory being that the memory of these events can somehow be recorded and held by the stones of a structure, or maybe just the landscape itself. If the stone tape theory does indeed hold any water, then perhaps it's not surprising that events from the past seem so ready to replay themselves here at this fort. After all, you couldn't really ask for a more likely receptacle of such phenomena than the immense Roman walls still standing at Burgh. But our next sighting doesn't seem to necessarily be tethered to the fort itself, as much as the estuary that once filled this landscape. Just to the north of the fort, Breydon Water, now a nature reserve, is the largest remaining expanse of water left behind by the ancient estuary. And it was here in the early 20th century where our next anniversary ghost story was born, as two small fishing boats were shaken from their quiet, chilly vigil one July night, when they witnessed a whole fleet of strange, old-looking ships sail past. But it wasn't just the fact that they looked like they came from a century-long past that frightened the fishermen. It was also that the large wake the vessels inevitably upset across the water did nothing to rock their boats. Apparently they could see figures aboard the strange craft, and one even looked their way, but the passengers didn't respond to the fishermen. In fact, it didn't seem that they could see them at all. And the sightings don't end there either. In September, witnesses have reported a pirate ship raining down fury on two smaller vessels. It can't help but lead one to wonder if there's not a case for this river confluence to be haunted in its own right, quite aside from any hauntings anchored to the flint and stone of the fort, perched hulkingly over the river valley, like an immemorial and watchful guardian.
The frustrating thing is that we don't have anything to point to what these anniversaries are of, not even which battle the ghostly fighting sounds might stem from. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that there are no records of any battles taking place here during Roman times. But this could simply be down to the fact that any records of such events just haven't survived. Of course, the fort's history and occupation didn't end with the Romans. Far from it. Because when the Romans left Britain, there came a time known widely as the Dark Ages, when the record-keeping Romans withdrew back to their homelands and the native Britons were left to their own devices to deal with the invading forces of the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Danes, none of whom were quite as fussed as the Romans with writing stuff down. Countless battles would have taken place during this time, but many of these were never recorded and so haven't made it into the history books. We do know from the archaeological record, however, that it was very common for these invaders to set up shop in the empty buildings and fortifications abandoned by the Romans. And as we emerge on the inside of the fort's north wall, it's easy to see why this structure wasn't left to waste. It's absolutely massive. We see for the first time the full width of the fort, and it's easily the area of 1.5 football pitches inside. Because we'd approached the fort straight on to the shortest side, I'd half thought that the small section we could see was about the extent of the ruins. I visited a few Roman ruins in my time, and so far everything I've experienced of Roman remains has been in fragments. I've seen a stretch of wall here, a gateway there, a scrap of floor mosaic, and lots of foundations. But this takes me by surprise because there's still so much of it upright. You certainly don't need any imagination to help you conjure up the enclosure of the fort. It takes me a few moments to process, and it seems this fort just keeps on taking us by surprise. Of course, there are sadly no remains of the interior buildings within the grounds of the fort. We have only the exterior perimeter walls, but it looks like there's space in here to contain a small medieval village. It's no wonder that it was used by the Saxons in later years, and after that, the Normans actually built a Motte and Bailey castle inside the walls. Yep, you heard that right. They built a whole castle inside the fort. Just in one little corner, in fact. Although there are no visual remains of the internal structures, if you take the time to look down at your feet, the ground is marked all over with curious bands and fairy rings of different coloured grass. A deeper green marks out the foundations of structures of the past. Especially outside the vast east wall, where aerial photography really shows up the evidence of a large civilian trading settlement, or vicus, that grew up at the edge of the garrison. It must once have been a noisy and bustling place, quite at odds with the hazy stillness of the site today, where the background hubbub is nothing more than the salty breeze from the marshes ruffling the leaves of the hedgerows and the cries of birds wheeling overhead. Another thing that's fascinatingly clear from the aerial photographs is the placement of the Norman castle that was constructed in the southwest corner of the fort. Now, it seems madness to me, but for some reason I can't quite fathom, the Normans broke right through one of the Roman walls to dig the ditch around their castle motte, leaving a great bite out of the otherwise perfectly sturdy edifice. None of the Norman castle mound remains to be seen today. 18th century farming levelled it and filled in the moat, the very thought of which makes me just wince at the loss of history. But you can certainly see where the ditch broke through the fort wall, and it makes for the most dramatic part of the site. From a distance, we can see that the south wall is in worse repair than the others. There are several sections missing or collapsed, and as we get closer and pass through the wall to the outside of the fort, we find that one of the bastions has actually tumbled down the south slope. From the outside, it becomes obvious that in fact the whole wall is leaning, splaying outwards at a crazy angle. At one point, there's a jagged tear all the way down the wall, almost as though a gargantuan lightning bolt has split the two asunder. The smaller section has keeled over at a crazy angle, looking every bit as though it will collapse with an earth-shaking crash at any moment. This, combined with the toppled round bastion tower laying on its side at the bottom of the slope, gives the scene an unreal feeling, like a game of dominoes frozen in the act of falling. I stand next to the collapsed tower so Fitz can take a photo for scale. There are chunks of fallen wall here as well, and I'm struck again by how thickly and impenetrably they were constructed. Over time, the fort has been ransacked for materials to the point where even the standing walls have been pecked away at and are slimmer than their original width. When built, the walls would have been 11 feet thick at the base, tapering to 5 feet thick at the top. The corner bastions would have been 14 feet in diameter, the remaining towers 12 feet. Standing next to the fallen masonry, I feel small not only in stature, but I also feel small against the weight of all that history. And this corner of the fort in particular has quite a lot to tell, and actually held on to a rather macabre secret for many, many years.
As we know, in the 11th century, the Normans raised an earth mound in this corner of the fort and constructed a timber castle on top of it. But the remains of this were decimated by agricultural practices by the time of the 18th century. It seems that the whole site must have been used for farming right into the 1950s, as reading archaeological reports from excavations carried out in the 50s and 60s, it's mentioned that the dig took place because of fears that ploughing would destroy valuable historical evidence and artefacts. Looking through the report further, it becomes evident that agriculture was indeed destroying not just artifacts, but bones. Human bones. Right underneath where the Normans built their castle, the topsoil was littered with human remains that were accidentally turned up by ploughing. When the archaeologists came and excavators dug down into the deeper soil, they found graves. A whole cemetery, in fact. 160 bodies, all buried in an east-west alignment. Unfortunately, this excavation was by no means comprehensive, and the report gives basically no information about the bodies, not whether they were men, women or children, old or young, or what they died from. We do know from radiocarbon dating that the bodies were of Middle Saxon date, around the 7th to 10th centuries. But other than that, the only real descriptions seem to be how much damage was sustained to the skeletons by ploughing, with graves disturbed or displaced, and bones jumbled, damaged, and even crushed. It seems to me that the people buried in this cemetery have certainly not received the respect and peaceful rest that they deserved. We don't know if the Normans were aware that they were building their castle right on top of over 100 burials, but that alone seems like enough to disturb anyone's eternal rest. Add to that the levelling of the mound, the regular ploughing up of skeletal remains, and then a couple of half-hearted and possibly damaging excavations over the years, and frankly I'm surprised the fort isn't teeming with unhappy spirits. Oddly though, it doesn't seem to be the restless wraiths of these wronged Saxons who are infamous for haunting this fort, but a more mysterious entity of legend.
If you know anything about Norfolk myth and legend, you'll have probably guessed by now that this is something to do with the Black Shuck. That huge, shaggy, blacker-than-night beast of a dog with glowing eyes that prowls the shadowy landscape of the Norfolk Broads at night. Almost every Norfolk town has a Black Shuck story. But here at Burgh Castle, the tale is a little bit different, not quite your run-of-the-mill Shuck stories, as the reports here concern an entity known as Old Scarf. Now, Old Scarf seems to have been a feared entity for centuries around the village of Burgh Castle and nearby Great Yarmouth. Mothers would threaten naughty children with Old Scarf's wrath. But it wasn't only a tale to scare the children. Apparently all the townsfolk were deathly afraid of encountering him. He was said to roam around Burgh Castle and Great Yarmouth between the hours of 12 and 2 in the morning, and could regularly be found on Yarmouth Bridge at midnight. The residents of the town took this so seriously that you would never find any of them near the bridge come midnight, and any souls still carousing at friends' houses into the wee hours would find some excuse or another to stay on until after 2 a.m, safely past the hours when Old Scarf was abroad. The feared figure does have a lot in common with the Black Shuck, and in one report of him accompanying a villager on his homeward walk one night, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference, at least to begin with. The terrified man became aware of a huge, shaggy black beast loping alongside him. The dreadful sound of heavy chains dragged by the beast, rattling and clanking like an ironmonger's forge, accompanied by the animal's low growling. But the thing Black Shuck is most famous for is being a harbinger of doom. In most tales, the witnesses come to harm in the days or months following an encounter with Shuck, the beast itself seemingly just a warning of doom to come. This doesn't hold true for this encounter with Old Scarf. Instead, the frightened villager actually addresses the animal and expresses his desire to be rid of the company, which I must interject sounds like a foolish thing to do to a massive otherworldly beast dragging chains and growling. But apparently that's what he did, and predictably, Old Scarf didn't respond well. In fact, it seized the villager roughly and flung him across the hedge. Miraculously, the man was largely unharmed, although dazed and bewildered to find himself in some marshes half a mile from the road he'd been travelling. And that's not the only deviation from the Black Shuck tales. This entity has almost a trickster-like aspect and is said to be able to take the form of a man or a dog. In fact, some reports even have him being witnessed transforming from a man into a dog. According to legend, he can also take the form of a massive goat with great luminous horns and glowing eyes. Now, a glowing goat may sound pretty comical, but local farmers were genuinely scared of this creature because whenever it was spotted, they would find their horses and cattle maimed and gored by what they presumed must be the loathsome horns of Old Scarf. Many think that the figure of Old Scarf is pretty ancient, and that the tale may have come over with the Danish invaders. But there's another story that has survived even more intact, having been remembered by locals for many centuries, and then, fortunately for us, recorded for posterity over 2 issues of the Yarmouth Independent newspaper in 1893. It tells the tale of Baron Rudolf Scarf, a 13th century German knight with a bad reputation. In the days when honour and loyalty were the highest of virtues, he was known for neither, reportedly switching sides whenever the odds swung in or out of favour, sometimes several times within the same battle. Although that's not the worst thing he was known for. His ways were said to be so wicked and debased that his peers and neighbours, although they loathed him, were too scared to do anything about it. Well, their reprieve came one day when the Baron went too far, messing with someone in greater power than him, as well as irreparably offending the Catholic Church. As a result, he was excommunicated from the church and chased out of the country. From there, he came to England and settled in Burgh Castle, where he continued his life of depravity and soon became as loathed in this country as he was in his last. However, he didn't have the protection of power to hide behind that he did in his homeland, and it wasn't long before he once again crossed the wrong person, who quickly dispatched his 2 most burly fellows to thoroughly put Baron Scarf in his place. Well, the Baron was as vengeful as he was wicked, and he wasn't going to take the beating lying down. That night he rained down curses upon the heads of his attackers and howled his vengeance to the sky as thunder roared in the heavens and lightning split the inky night. The unnatural storm raged on with winds shaking houses to their foundations and meteor-like objects raining down from the sky, exploding in showers of sparks as they hit the earth. Finally, the Baron called upon all the powers of heaven and hell that he would get his revenge. And so sure of this was he that he invited the devil himself to carry him away should he fail. And on these final fateful words, Scarf and the band of nefarious fellow reprobates he had gathered into his company was startled by a tremendous flash of lightning, accompanied by not thunder, but a maniacal cackle. The riotous band looked on in horror as the figure of a dog appeared in blood-red flame upon the ceiling, and underneath it, an unnatural fire etched out the words, "As a dog thou shalt wander, Scarf, until the crack of doom." After this portentous event, many of Scarf's companions became changed men, shaken in their beliefs enough to pursue a less villainous way of life. But not Scarf. He continued his dastardly ways, hell-bent on revenge. But, spoiler alert, he never did get it. He simply carried on trying to do wicked, barony things, but without any backup from the chums he'd frightened off, and without any of the power or favour he had held in his native country, so he didn't make much progress really, and eventually died old, bitter and alone, just as you might expect of the villain of such a tale. But it was after he died that a curious thing happened, when his body went missing before it could make it to the grave. One moment the dead and cold Baron was laid out in the viewing chamber, and the next he was gone. But the servants didn't take too long to figure out what had happened when they saw strangely shaped footprints burned into the floor, leading all the way up to the bed where the Baron had lain. As far as they were concerned, he had got his comeuppance, and they washed their hands of the matter. The village of Burgh Castle collectively breathed a sigh of relief to be rid of the hated man. But it was short-lived, because after his death, people started to go missing, especially women. And at the same time, a huge, ferocious black dog with bristling hair and eyes that flashed with fire began to be seen prowling around the village and castle ruins after dark. Remembering the events and prophecy of the night of that unnatural storm as recalled by the surviving witnesses, suspicion quickly fell on the Baron, and monks were called in to deal with the supernatural forces suspected to be at work. The legend goes that the Holy Brethren eventually succeeded in taking the beast prisoner and immediately secured him with massive, specially forged chains. They incarcerated him underneath a priory in Great Yarmouth, whose vaults extended beneath the River Yar, and here he was bound to stay for as long as the waters flowed beneath Yarmouth Bridge. Thankfully, the river does still flow beneath Yarmouth Bridge, although it's a different bridge to the one in the story, having been rebuilt after the collapse of the original. The priory is long gone, although some of the vaults are said to remain under the present location of the Duke's Head Hotel. Whether it was the loss of the bridge, or the priory, or something else entirely, we do not know. But at some point, old Scarf managed to slip his chains and escape, and all the monks could do was to curtail his hours of prowling to between midnight and 2 a.m. If indeed the story has its roots in the 13th century, it's pretty incredible that it survived until this retelling of it in 1893, at which point, according to the author, it was still well remembered by older generations, and well entrenched enough that some locals would still avoid the bridge at midnight. But it was starting to fade with the younger generation, and perhaps that's why he decided to recount it in the paper and preserve it for years to come. At any rate, the author reports that, to his knowledge at least, no one in the last half-century had encountered the dreaded beast. However, we know that reports of huge, shuck-like creatures do continue around Norfolk and other areas of England to this day. When we first started looking into this figure of legend, we assumed it was a phantom of the past, but have been surprised to find over the years that there are reports of contemporary encounters with the beast. Although whether any of these are specifically Old Scarf, we don't know. But if there's anywhere a creature of legend could choose to haunt, you couldn't find a much better one than the ruins of Burgh Castle, overlooking the lonely, mysterious marshland of the Norfolk Broads.
And that wraps it up pretty nicely, doesn't it? Well, no, because anyone who's heard of Burgh Castle in a paranormal context, or ever looked it up in a book, will be yelling at us right now. But what about the body wrapped in a flag? Because we've missed out the ghost story that Burgh Castle is most famous for. The sight of a body wrapped in a white flag that's being hurled from the top of the fort walls. Now, I got quite excited when I first read about this story. One of my books went into great detail about it, recounting a great battle that took place between Saxons and Danes, telling the story of how the fort was taken over by Danish invaders under the command of a chieftain named Gonard. The story goes that in the time of war between Danes and Saxons, Gonard took a Saxon nobleman by the name of Seberg hostage, and soon enough, Seberg's brother Serdag came to bust him out. Well, it all went quite badly. Seberg managed to kill Gonard, but one of Gonard's men killed Seberg right back. Serdag knew none of this and sent one of his men into the castle to demand the release of his brother, but that emissary was sent right back out again, dead, wrapped in a white flag and hurled from the top of the castle walls. And this rather ghastly apparition of that lifeless body being flung down from the 15-foot-high flint and mortar walls has become the prevailing ghost story that's made it into pretty much every book on haunted Norfolk.
So you can imagine my frustration when I tried to find out more about this battle and the characters involved. I looked, and I looked, and Fitz looked, and I looked some more, and Fitz looked again, and even the cat looked, and none of us could find absolutely anything about this battle. There wasn't even any record of the names of the Danish and Saxon leaders, and come to think of it, they didn't even seem like Danish and Saxon names. No Google foo we could muster would uncover any details about this mythical battle until I finally got a hit on the names that led me to a treasure trove. In my geeky little mind, it may as well have been a Saxon hoard. It took me to the Hidden East Anglia website and a complete archived catalogue of a little-known magazine called The Lantern. I say magazine, but we're not talking about the glosses here. This is a grainy, faded zine that looks like it was hand-typed on a typewriter. It's the sort of thing those of us from my generation will remember from garage band fanzines, and it's absolutely glorious. Produced by a group of paranormal investigators from East Anglia during the 1970s and 80s, it records all their musings, projects and findings as they delve into the world of paranormal and explore the mysteries and curiosities of the area. That may not sound terribly exciting to some of you, but this was produced back in the day when people really did their research. I mean, they put me to shame. The article I found, the author had spent 18 months researching. 18 months! He'd included a bibliography that included titles from both the Society of Psychical Research and the Bodleian Library. If I was a Victorian lady, I would have needed to loosen my corsets at this point. Needless to say, I printed it all off immediately. The only shame was what it had to report, and rather tellingly, the article I hit on was titled Hoax of the Broads. In a nutshell, this group of investigators had for some time based their investigations around information from the most prominent paranormal Norfolk book of the time, a title by Dr. Charles Sampson called Ghosts of the Broads, published in 1931. However, as time went on, the group began to doubt the integrity and authenticity of the material collected within, until one of them decided to go headfirst down the rabbit hole and find out the truth of the matter once and for all. and he wasn't happy with what he found. The author, Charles Sampson, had cited resources and provided a bibliography, as you would expect from any well-researched book. However, the trouble came when the investigator, Mike Burgess, looked into these cited sources for confirmation of the author's claims. Unfortunately, what he found was that the majority of the sources given in Ghosts of the Broads didn't exist. They were made up. And the few that did exist, when checked, contained no mention of the story supposedly drawn from them. Of course, we can't discount the possibility that there was a grain of truth to the original paranormal sightings, and that the author just rather monstrously embellished the history. But if an author has gone to so much trouble to pretend to have written a work of factual credibility, when instead they've embroidered a work of fiction, it doesn't really give you much cause to think that there might even be a nugget of truth in there. And he would have got away with it too if it weren't for those meddling kids. Unfortunately, I can't check the book for myself. It's out of print and copies of it are going currently in the region of hundreds of pounds, and I'm not sure I'd want to own it anyway, given the context. But I don't have any reason to doubt the investigations of Mike Burgess on behalf of the Lantern. I only hope that none of the other sightings of Burgh Castle were cooked up by this particular author. I will make sure we put the links to the archive of The Lantern in the show notes in case any of you want to have a look for yourselves. Personally, I am looking forward to having a bit of a retro fest and picking through all the other issues as soon as I get time.
I can attest to the fact that Lil was not amused when she discovered this fact.
I was not. This episode, it was less of a rabbit hole and more of a rabbit warren.
Yes, a rabbit hole with lots of dead ends.
Yeah, there were a lot of twists and turns. This was definitely a journey, this one. And we didn't sort of include it in the main bulk of the episode because it was such a digression from the narrative. Mm-hmm. But Fitch, you kind of discovered some historical, not inaccuracies, some new findings about the history of the Romans as we were sort of researching this episode.
Yeah, this was a really big one because according to the sort of established history, the Romans kind of went, 410, let's go home.
Yeah, we'll leave Britain. You're on your own. There's a lot of the well-established tradition is that the emperor wrote a letter to Britain basically saying, we're off, ta-ta, see ya, cheery bye.
Yeah, and then everybody left. And it seems that whilst, in any sort of summary like that, it's not going to be quite as cut and dry.
No.
It looks like there's a lot of evidence now to point that was not even close to being correct.
No.
From what I was reading, and bearing in mind that I'm not a researcher, I was busy looking for ghost stories to do with this show, so this was sort of incidental. But it appears that letter saying "Tatar, look over yourselves" wasn't necessarily for Britain. It might have been a misspelling and was meant for an island in southern Italy or something.
Yeah.
And there's certainly Roman construction continuing in various towns a minimum 20 years afterwards. And from what I was reading, it seemed to imply that there was letters requesting military aid from Rome, even sort of 150 years later. So I don't know how true that is or whether that also is a mistake, but it does seem to imply that it wasn't the it's 410 AD, let's go home situation that seems to be the current sort of history of the British Isles and the Romans leaving Britain.
Well, it's definitely not the first example I've heard of history basically changing on the discovery that somebody's mistranslated a text. Because let's face it, that is all the evidence we have. It's like when we were talking about the fact that there's no record of any battles there. Well, it doesn't mean there wasn't. It just means that either they weren't written down, or they were written down and they got lost, or they were written down and the name of the place they took place at got mistranslated, or was called something different. Or there's just so many things when we're talking about just such scraps of evidence we have. Yep. There's such a lot that can go wrong there.
I even found a hint that the Saxon and Danish warlords in the story were potentially a sort of misspelling of real people. But from what I could see, they weren't really tied to Burgh Castle. They'd landed hundreds of miles down the coast or something and weren't in the area. It's almost as if he'd kind of taken something close enough-ish to kind of make some sense and throw it in there.
I definitely get that impression. I mean, I don't really want the book, but I would be interested to look at it. It really feels a lot to me like the author's taken elements he fancied from bits and pieces and maybe locations nearby, and yeah, there probably is an element or a nugget of truth in there somewhere, and he's just taken a lot of liberties weaving those together to make some stories. But I don't even if he'd written a book on folklore, I wouldn't even necessarily have so much of a problem with that. It's the fact that he's doctored resources to make it look like this is a research thing and it's factual.
Yeah, that was the most galling thing for me, I think, was the false bibliography.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like this one thing, just sort of like, pass this off as a sort of myth or legend or what have you. Maybe you'll get away with it. It's not a very good thing to do. But the fact that he's made up sources,
I know,
that's like that premeditation. It's like,
yeah, it's almost like he thought I'll fool the locals. It's just...
It's the difference between manslaughter and murder. He's not just had a crime of passion like, I really love this story, I'm just going to write it down and tell him it's true.
Can you tell how incensed we are about it? The thing is, it's people like that A, give the paranormal field a bad name. Mm-hmm. They really do. I know this chap was, 1930s or whatever, but the legacy of that does live on. It gives the paranormal world a bad name of being, not a well-researched, not a educational place to be. And also it makes it so difficult for researchers in the future, people that are trying to find, ways to investigate, places to investigate, the history behind the stories. I really thought that was going to lead to an actual battle and that was going to be some really interesting history. And to find it was just made up is really, it's so disappointing.
It is, because when you're doing research of these things, when you might come across a web page that's like Ghost Stories of Norfolk. And you're like, oh, okay, let's have a look at these. And you find out what the stories are, and then you try and drag them back, and you go back as early as you can. And when you find a source that's like, the Ghost of the Broads, and it's got a bibliography half as long as your arm saying, we got these stories from this, and this. You think, that's a reliable source.
That's reliable. Yeah, exactly. There's only so much you can do. And bearing in mind, we've got now probably 6 different books on Norfolk ghost stories.
And they've all got this in it.
There is one that hasn't got it in. There is one by good old Betty. I can't remember her last name, but she must get credit because she did not include it. I don't know whether that's because she doubted its authenticity, but she did not include this one. But every other book, and some of these were published like 2010. Mm-hmm. So, recent enough to have been able to, figure this out. But
and we like to do our research, but good old Mike spent 18 months doing that.
That is dedication, Mike.
We put as much effort in as we can for our monthly episodes.
But we don't have 18 months.
No, at best, we're sort of working on something as we're about to record something. So, you're perhaps at best getting sort of a month, 6 weeks worth of research for every episode, which, is not to be sniffed at. When you're working another job as well, doing 6 weeks worth of research on something takes it out of you.
But I mean, Mike, just kudos and our gratitude, man. Wherever you are out there.
If I ever meet you, I'm going to buy you a pint.
Yeah, seriously. But with all that said, Burgh Castle is an amazing place to visit. The atmosphere looking out over the Broads, over the marshland is incredible. And it's just such an amazing Roman ruin. And I say ruin, but I know I harped on a lot about how intact it was, but that's difficult to come by. And I couldn't believe I didn't realise until we started looking into it that it was a Roman ruin. I just thought it was a castle. And I couldn't believe that even after we'd been, I actually looked through a few Googled lists of like top 10 Roman remains and top 10 like most intact Roman remains in the UK. Didn't even make the list.
No, it's a bit of a hidden gem.
It is. And I think it's just because it's not been archaeologically excavated very well.
Yeah, and it wasn't breathtaking as such, but it did make me stop short when we climbed those steps and walked past the wall and looked, and then you could see the scale of this thing inside.
We're just not used to seeing Roman remains on that level.
It was huge. You could have built a cathedral in there and had room left over. It's massive.
Yeah, and if you're in the area, do go and check it out. I don't know why it's not well known, any more well known than it is, but yeah, fantastic location.
So yeah, check it out. And best of all, the car park's free.
Yes.
So if you're looking for a cheap day out in the UK,
the car park's free and the castle's free. It's all free.
Yep, go ahead and check out a 1700-year-old castle.
For any of our patrons who have watched the video of us visiting Burgh Castle, you will know that we also visited Great Yarmouth Minster. And we didn't address that in this episode at all, basically just because by the time I'd got halfway through writing this episode, I realised there was no way we were ever going to have time to talk about Great Yarmouth as well. So fear not, that will be coming in a future episode.
And with that, I'm afraid it is the end of this episode of Knock Once for Yes. Thank you to everyone that shared their story this episode. And don't forget that if you've got a story to share, you can get in touch through our website at knockonceforyes.com. We are always in need of your true paranormal experiences, as they are the heart of the show. There you can also find links to all of our social media, so do please join us on those and take a peek at some of the places we've been and have a chat. Thank you again to our patrons, whose support is vital for us to be able to keep producing this show. And if you'd like to support the show, please do consider becoming our patron, which you can do by following the links on our website or by visiting patreon.com/KOFY. And patrons, do look out for the next Zoom meeting plan, and we'll be posting shortly the video of the next place we've been. See, we've been doing things in advance. It's amazing. You don't have to support us financially, even though we really do appreciate it. You can help the show by spreading the word and helping us reach more listeners, rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to the show, and by interacting with us on social media. It really helps out, and it doesn't cost a penny. Knock Once for Yes is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio, and if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Knock Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com, and we hope you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Knock Once for Yes.